intraperitoneal. Some structures during development will start out suspended by a mesentery, will get twisted around and pushed up against the abdominal wall, and will become what we call secondarily retroperitoneal. So something like that. So this would be a secondarily retroperitoneal structure. So at some point during its development, it was suspended by a mesentery, but in the adult, it's going to be behind parietal peritoneum. Does anyone have an idea of what this secondarily retroperitoneal structure would be here from this totally accurate cross-section of a human being? So what do you think these are?
Kidneys.
Okay, so these are kidneys. So we're in sort of the upper part of the abdomen. This looks like a tube that's running up and down. Maybe we're not that far up. Is the stomach secondarily retroperitoneal? So this is probably our descending or second part of the duodenum here. So we're on the right side. So remember, the stomach would be over on the left. So we're on the right side. We're secondarily retroperitoneal, and it's a small tube. But our examples of secondarily retroperitoneal are two parts of the duodenum, the pancreas, and then the ascending and descending colons. Some structures, like the kidney that we pointed out before, are never suspended by a mesentery. They're going to be retroperitoneal throughout all of development, and these are going to be primarily retroperitoneal. So there's a bunch of these. So most of the blood vessels, so the descending aorta, inferior vena cava, our sympathetic chain, kidneys, the ureters coming from them, suprarenal glands, as well as the gonadal vessels. The gonads originally start as retroperitoneal structures, but then they descend out of the abdomen and either into the pelvis or outside the body wall. All right, so you probably noticed when you got into the abdomen that the abdomen is highly asymmetric. So we have certain structures that are just on the right or left side. And this is different than most parts of the body. Most parts of the body are relatively symmetrical. So where we see major asymmetry like this, especially in unpaired organs, we can assume that at some point during development, these probably were symmetrical midline structures. And during development, they've been shifted around and placed in different parts of the body. And that's going to be the case in our abdomen especially. So if we go back in time far enough into development, there is a time where all of these structures, like the liver and the stomach and the spleen and so forth, are going to be lying along a midline plane. So here's our aorta in the back. We talked about this stage of development before when we were discussing why we get the celiac trunk and the mesenteric arteries going to different structures. Okay, here's our stomach in the midline. This loop that sort of sticks out the umbilical region here is the midgut. A number of unpaired organs. We have the liver and gallbladder will start out on the ventral surface. The spleen and part of the pancreas will start out on the dorsal surface. And you can see these are all connected by one sheet of mesentery that's called the dorsal mesentery. Connecting our stomach to our liver, we have that lesser omentum, and we have a falciform ligament connecting the liver to the anterior body wall. So dorsal mesentery, and these are part of the ventral mesentery. So from this stage, we're going to get into a weird part of development where different parts of the gut tube are going to rotate independent of one another. So the foregut structures are going to rotate approximately 90 degrees in the clockwise direction, and the midgut is going to rotate counterclockwise somewhere in the region of 270 degrees. So I have sort of a real janky animation type thing of this that we'll walk through. So first, just pay attention to the foregut structures. And you can see them, they start out in a midline plane, and as they rotate 90 degrees, the liver gets shunted over to the right, and the spleen and stomach shift over onto the left side. Right? So 90-degree shift there. What's happening in the midgut is a little more complicated. It twists a lot more. Oops. And as it does, it drags the hindgut along with it, so that we end up with this almost complete circle, or 270 degrees of a circle that will represent the colon. All right, so here's what it looks like after all of that. We end up with our stomach on the left and our duodenum on the right. And we end up with our descending colon on the left and ascending colon on the right. So if we think back to that original dorsal mesentery, a number of those named ligaments we just went over are going to be derived from that original dorsal mesentery. So here is going to be a connection from the posterior body wall at about the point of the kidney that will run over to the spleen. This is called the splenorenal ligament. And here's our connection between the spleen and the stomach, or the gastrosplenic. So these are remnants of that original dorsal mesentery. Here's our hepatogastric ligament and our falciform ligament that are parts of that original ventral mesentery. This rotation, this 90-degree rotation of the foregut, is what also defines or gives us our lesser sac that you guys poked your finger into on Friday, and separates off this region of the peritoneal cavity from the rest of the peritoneal cavity, or the greater sac. Okay, so here's our lesser omentum covering up our lesser sac. The entryway that's left over to get into the lesser sac was behind the hepatoduodenal ligament that you all stuck your finger in on Friday. This was the omental foramen. And here it is in cross-section. So if we go back briefly to our development, that dorsal mesentery that hangs off of the greater curvature is just sort of hanging here, folded over on itself. And this is going to expand down to eventually form our greater omentum. So if we look at that in cross-section, we have our stomach, this long band of dorsal mesentery that's going to separate the lesser sac from the greater sac. Within the lesser sac, we have a superior and an inferior recess. Greater sac. Here's our two sheets of dorsal mesentery. But during development, a lot of these things that are hanging out here are going to fuse together to form that greater omentum. So our anterior and posterior sheets of dorsal mesentery will fuse together, and they'll also fuse with the transverse colon down here. So this is what we would see more in an adult. So our apron of greater omentum is what's left over from those two original folds of the dorsal mesentery. And this is also where we form that gastrocolic ligament, or that connection between the stomach and the transverse colon. Okay, so almost done. So now a little preview of some of the posterior abdominal wall structures that you'll see on Wednesday. So I talked on Friday about how various structures need to get into the abdomen from the thorax. And one of the ways they did this was by passing behind the diaphragm. And as they passed behind the diaphragm, they passed under what are called arcuate ligaments, or arch-shaped ligaments. So the diaphragm itself has a few different parts. We have these fleshy fibers around the edges. We have a big central tendon in the middle. And then we have a part that wrapped around the aorta called the left and right crus. So crus just means legs, so we have left and right legs of the diaphragm wrapping around either side of the aorta. Within the right crus extends way up here, and it actually wraps around the esophagus, so they're not perfectly symmetrical. There are a couple of muscles that are going to pass from a little bit higher up down into the abdomen. We mentioned these last time, so quadratus lumborum is the sort of rectangular one in the lumbar region. And then we have this big long one, psoas major and minor. So these three structures here are going to be important for identifying our three arcuate ligaments. Also recall that our thoracic splanchnics need to get down into the abdomen, and they do so by passing through the crura of the diaphragm. So they're not going to pass behind it, they're going to pass right through it. All right, so shown in yellow, we have this arcuate ligament right in the middle, and whenever we have something in the middle, we call it the median. So our median arcuate ligament is going to be a passageway for the descending aorta to get from the thorax into the abdomen. Next, shown in blue, we have the passageway for our psoas muscles coming in, and these will be medial arcuate ligaments. And our last one, shown in green, are called the lateral arcuate ligaments, and these will be over top of that quadratus lumborum. Right, and we'll finish off with a few of the nerves of the posterior abdominal wall that you'll see on Wednesday. So we will find the subcostal nerve, or the ventral ramus of T12. We'll poke in, usually enters in underneath that lateral arcuate ligament. We'll also find two branches of L1, the iliohypogastric and ilioinguinal. And those should sound familiar because we at least tried to find those on the anterior abdominal wall with the varying levels of success. And we'll also find the lumbar sympathetic trunk running down through here, as well as a whole bunch of other nerves that are going down into the lower limb that we're not going to pay quite as much attention to. Okay, so that's it for the lecture. I've got one quick announcement before we head down to lab, and that is that everyone should be extra kind to Peter today. So it's Peter's birthday.